On her wedding night, the cold Duke refused to touch her. The candles on the nightstand burned low, and the room smelled of beeswax and cold stone. Clara stood at the window, still wearing her wedding dress, ivory silk that caught the faint candlelight and held it softly, like something that didn't quite belong to the night around it. Outside, frost covered the grounds of the Duke's estate, and the bare trees along the long drive stood perfectly still against a pale winter sky. She pressed one hand flat against the glass. The cold moved through her palm immediately, sharp, immediate, the way certain truths arrive before you are ready for them. She waited. The clock on the mantelpiece struck 10, then the quarter hour, then 11, each chime falling into the silence of the room with a weight that was difficult to ignore. The fire in the hearth burned quietly, sending long shadows across the stone floor, and the connecting door, the door between her chamber and his, did not move. Not once. Clara stood at the window, and then sat on the edge of the bed, and then stood again, and the door stayed closed, and the keyhole on her side showed nothing but darkness beyond it. No light, no footsteps, no sound of movement from the other side. She sat on the edge of the bed and folded her hands in her lap, and looked at the door and waited until waiting made no sense anymore. The fire dropped to embers. The cold crept in from the glass behind her, steady and patient, the way cold always works in old stone houses, finding the small gaps, settling into corners, making itself at home without asking permission. Clara pulled the heavy counterpane over her shoulders and lay down on top of the covers, still dressed, and stared at the ceiling. High, pale, ornate in the near dark. She told herself it didn't matter. She said it twice, quietly, to the empty room. She didn't believe it either time. Sleep didn't come for a long time. The wind moved against the walls of the hall outside, pressing at the old stone the way wind does when it has nowhere else to go, and the house settled around her in its slow, familiar rhythms, timber shifting, pipes cooling, the deep quiet of a place that has stood through many winters and expects to stand through many more. Clara lay still and listened to all of it, and somewhere in the long middle of the night, just before exhaustion finally pulled her under, she heard it, a single sound from deep inside the manor. A door, closing quietly, not carelessly. Closed with deliberate care, as if the person on the other side thought carefully before letting it settle into the frame. She opened her eyes and stared at the ceiling and listened. The house gave her nothing more. Just that one careful sound, and then silence, and then the slow pull of sleep she could no longer resist. Why wouldn't he come? The question followed her down into the dark. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. From which country are you listening to this story tonight? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one. And if this is your first time here, subscribe, because what this man does next, no one sees it coming. Clara married William, the Duke, on a grey Thursday morning in late October, 3 days after she signed the papers in the solicitor's office on a narrow street in town. Her father left nothing behind but silence and debt. Debt that swallowed everything with quiet efficiency. The house, the horses, the furniture. Her mother chose piece by piece over 30 years of careful, loving accumulation. Clara sat across from the solicitor and listened to figures read aloud in a calm professional voice, and the room grew smaller with each one, and when it was over, she walked out into the cold street and stood on the pavement and understood, with complete clarity, that there was no version of the future that didn't require her to do something she didn't want to do. The letter arrived 4 days later. She read it standing in the empty parlor, the walls stripped bare, the floors cold without their rugs. One page, brief, almost impersonal, the kind of letter written by a man who considers his words carefully and wastes none of them. The Duke offered to settle every outstanding debt in full, in exchange for her hand in marriage. A prompt response was appreciated. She read it twice. Then she went to the writing desk and found the last sheet of good paper and wrote her answer before she could think too carefully about what she was agreeing to. She sealed it. She sent it. Because there was no real choice inside the letter, only the shape of one offered with enough courtesy to make the absence of alternatives easier to accept. At the altar 3 days later, William stood beside her with the stillness of a man who long ago decided what he would and wouldn't show in public. He spoke his vows without hesitation. He placed the ring on her finger with steady hands. He looked straight ahead during the ceremony with an expression that revealed nothing, not coldness, not warmth, not reluctance, not relief. Just presence. Just a man honoring a promise with the full weight of his attention and none of his feeling. In the carriage that brought them to the estate that afternoon, they sat across from each other, and the bare winter fields moved past the windows in silence, and the hall appeared at the end of the long drive, large and dark against the fading light, its stone walls the color of old winters. Clara looked at it and felt the word home sit wrong in her chest. And now the wedding night passed in silence, and the connecting door stayed closed, and Clara lay in the dark of the Duke's manor with frost thickening on the glass, and one question turning slowly in her mind. Not a dramatic question, not a frightened one, just a quiet, persistent thing that settled in beside her like an uninvited guest and showed no sign of leaving. What kind of man agrees to this marriage and then leaves her entirely alone? She didn't know yet, but something told her the answer mattered more than she expected. In the days that followed, Clara learned the shape of her new life one room at a time. The manor revealed itself slowly. Stone corridors that returned every footstep in echo, high ceilings that made voices feel smaller than they were, windows set deep into thick walls that let in more pale sky than warmth. She moved through it carefully, the way you move through a place you are not yet sure belongs to you. She touched nothing she didn't need to touch. She opened no doors that weren't already open. The house held its history quietly, in the worn stone at the center of each step, in the smell of cold air and old fires that lived permanently in the walls, in the way certain rooms felt inhabited, even when no one was in them. William rose before dawn without exception. By the time Clara came downstairs each morning, he was already somewhere beyond the house, in the study with the lamp still burning, or riding the outer fields in the grey morning light, or walking the grounds with the quiet attention of a man who knows every inch of his estate and checks it anyway. She found traces of him each day like small ordinary facts left behind, a coat folded over the back of a chair, a cup of tea still faintly warm on the library table, a book left open on his desk to a page he didn't finish. She learned his habits before she learned anything else about him, because his habits were the part of him he didn't think to conceal. They shared dinner each evening in the long dining room, candles burning between them, the winter dark pressing at the tall windows. He was never unkind. When she spoke, he answered, clearly, without impatience, without making her feel that her words were an interruption. He noticed when her glass stood empty and filled it without comment. He passed things before she asked, but he never started a conversation himself. He never let a silence grow into something warmer. He answered and listened and then returned to wherever his thoughts lived when the room didn't require them, and the evenings moved forward in a steady, courteous quiet that felt to Clara like the surface of something much deeper she didn't yet have permission to touch. She watched him the way she always watched things she didn't understand, quietly, without letting him see. She noticed he never raised his voice, not to her, not to anyone in the house. She noticed the way he stood when she entered a room every single time, without exception, a small automatic gesture of respect that he seemed entirely unaware of performing. She noticed the faint scar along his left jaw, silver white with age, and wondered what put it there and how long ago, and whether it still ached in cold weather the way old scars sometimes do. She noticed that when the wind rose outside and the hall groaned and shifted the way stone buildings do in deep winter, something moved briefly across his face. Not fear, but recognition, as if the sound of the old walls in the cold was familiar to him in a way that went beyond habit. She noticed that he kept a careful, deliberate distance in every shared space, not hostile, not dismissive, but measured, as if proximity required thought, as if he calculated, each time he entered a room she occupied, exactly how close was appropriate, and then held to that line without variation. It wasn't the behavior of a man who disliked her. She understood that clearly enough. It was the behavior of a man who lived by a set of rules he made for himself, rules she couldn't yet see the shape of, or understand the reason for. One afternoon in the third week, Clara sorted books in the library. She gave herself the task simply to have something purposeful to do with her hands. She worked along the far shelves slowly, checking spines, straightening what needed attention. Near the end of the highest row she could reach, she pulled a volume forward and something slipped from between its pages and fell to the shelf below. A small portrait folded once, the paper soft with age. She picked it up and opened it before she thought about whether she should. A young woman looked back at her, dark hair pinned simply, a face with something unresolved in its expression, caught somewhere between certainty and a grief too settled to be recent. She looked no older than 20 when it was painted. Clara turned it over. On the back, in careful measured ink, the same handwriting she recognized from the ledgers on William's desk. 2 words and a year. Margaret, 1843. Clara stood with it in her hands for a long moment. Then she placed it back between the same 2 pages, at the same angle, exactly as she found it. She said nothing to anyone. That evening at dinner, she watched William differently than before. She looked at the line of his jaw and the steadiness of his hands and the way his eyes moved to some middle distance when he thought she wasn't paying attention. That particular stillness that arrived in his face when his mind went somewhere the room couldn't follow. She thought about the portrait, about the year on the back, about what it takes for a man to keep something like that between the pages of a book for more than 30 years, not displayed, not discarded, just held, quietly, without explanation. She thought about the word honor, how it could mean so many different things depending on the weight a person placed on it, and what they were willing to carry in silence to keep it. She didn't ask him about Margaret. Some part of her understood, without knowing why, that the answer would change how she saw everything else. The closed door on the wedding night, the careful distance, the measured way he moved through his own home, as if he was still deciding, after all these years, how much comfort he deserved inside it. She wasn't ready for that yet. She needed more time with the smaller things first, with the cup of tea left warm, the coat on the chair, the book left open to an unfinished page, before she could hold something larger. William set down his glass and looked up briefly. He caught her watching him. For 1 second, just one, something shifted in his expression, something that arrived and left so quickly she almost decided she imagined it, a softening, a crack in the careful surface, there and gone before it fully formed. Then he looked back at his plate, and the dinner continued and the candles burned quietly between them. Clara looked down at her own hands. Her wedding ring caught the candlelight, a simple band, plain gold, chosen without her input. She turned it once around her finger, slowly, without thinking about it. And she understood, with a quiet certainty she couldn't fully explain, that she was not going to stop thinking about this man. Whatever he kept behind that careful silence, whatever promise or grief or old wound shaped the way he moved through the world, she was already too curious to let it alone. That was the part she hadn't expected. November settled over the estate like a held breath. The cold came gradually at first, a sharpness in the early mornings, frost on the garden paths that melted by noon, the kind of cold that reminds you it is only the beginning. Then, one night in the 3rd week, it arrived in full. Clara woke to silence of a particular quality, the muffled, complete silence that only snow produces, and went to the window and found the grounds transformed. The garden lay buried under a smooth white layer, the bare trees standing black against it, the long drive 2 pale lines disappearing into the distance. She stood at the glass, with her breath fogging faintly in the cold air of the room, and looked at it for a long time. There was something almost honest about a landscape stripped that bare. Nothing hidden, nothing softened. Just the plain shape of things under all that white. She was beginning to feel that way about the manor itself. The boiler in the east wing failed on a Tuesday evening without warning. The pipes groaned once, deep and reluctant, and then went quiet in a way that felt more final than the noise. Within an hour, the cold worked its way through the walls of Clara's room with steady efficiency, finding every corner, settling into the curtains and the bedcovers and the air itself. She sat on the edge of the bed and watched her breath form small pale clouds in front of her face. She didn't make a production of it. She picked up her book, her candle, and her wool coat, and moved without fuss to the sitting room near the main hearth, the warmest room in the hall, with a wide fireplace and 2 armchairs positioned close enough to feel it properly. She settled in, tucked her feet beneath her, opened her book and let the warmth reach her fingers slowly, then her face, then the tight place between her shoulders she hadn't realized she was holding. She heard his footsteps in the corridor before she saw him. William appeared in the doorway, still in his outdoor clothes, the cold of the evening travelling in with him. He stopped when he saw her. Clara looked up. A moment passed between them, unplanned, quiet, neither of them entirely prepared for it. "The east wing," she said. "I know," he said. "3 days to repair, perhaps 4. I hope this room is all right. He looked at her for a moment, steady, without coldness, and then crossed the room and took the armchair on the opposite side of the fire. He removed his coat, placed it over the arm of the chair, and reached for the book on the side table beside him. Clara watched him settle with the ease of a man returning to something familiar, as if this chair and this fire and this particular evening were simply his, and she had quietly become part of the arrangement without either of them marking the exact moment it happened. She looked back at her page. Neither of them said anything more. The silence that filled the room that night felt different from every silence before it, warmer somehow, less constructed. The fire crackled steadily between them, and the wind pressed softly at the tall windows, and the clock on the mantel marked the slow hours, and neither of them moved to end the evening early. Clara turned a page. William turned a page. Outside, the snow continued to fall over the grounds of the estate in slow, unhurried silence, and the hall held them both in its old stone warmth, and nothing was required of either of them except to simply be there. This is all right, Clara thought. This is actually all right. The repair extended to 5 days. Each evening William appeared, took his chair, opened his book. Each evening Clara did the same. By the third night she stopped registering it as unusual and simply arrived, the way you arrive somewhere that has become familiar without your noticing the precise moment it changed. She began to see smaller things about him in those evenings, the way he read with complete attention, never skimming, never rushing a page. The way he sometimes paused mid-chapter and looked into the fire, not distracted, just thinking, his expression going still and inward in a way that made him look, briefly, less guarded than usual. The way the firelight moved across the side of his face when he looked down at the page, and the way his jaw relaxed slightly when he thought no one was watching. She noticed that he was always careful not to appear to look at her. Or, more precisely, he was careful not to be caught doing it. On the fourth evening, Clara read by the small candle on the table beside her chair. The light was poor, the candle burned low, and the shadows shifted with every small draught, and she found herself leaning closer to the page without realizing it, her neck tipping forward, her eyes working harder than they should have needed to. She said nothing about it. The following evening she came to the sitting room and found a different lamp on the table beside her chair. Not the small candle, a proper reading lamp, the wick trimmed, the glass clean, the light warm and steady and perfectly positioned for someone sitting in that specific chair reading in that specific direction. Clara stood beside the chair and looked at the lamp for a moment. Then she sat down and opened her book, and the words were clear and easy and the light didn't flicker. She didn't look at William, but she was aware of him across the fire, with an awareness that had nothing to do with the room or the warmth or the quiet evening around them. She was aware of the specific fact of him, of the attention it required to notice a thing so small, and the care it required to do something about it without making it a moment, without placing any weight on it at all, without asking for a single thing in return. Her fingers rested on the open page. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees along the garden wall, and somewhere deep in the old house, a timber settled with a low, resonant sound. Clara looked at the words in front of her and didn't read them. She thought about small gestures, about what it means when a person pays attention to you in the quiet ways, the ways that ask for no acknowledgement, that carry no expectation, that exist purely because someone saw you and thought about what you needed before you thought to ask. She thought about duty and what lies on the other side of it. She thought about the portrait between the pages of the book, Margaret, 1843. She thought about a man who kept a promise she didn't yet know the shape of. The lamp burned warm and steady beside her, and Clara sat with that warmth and understood, simply and without drama, that she was no longer just observing William from a careful distance. She was beginning to want to know him. December arrived quietly, on a morning of pale light and still air. Clara woke to a world gone white outside her window, the grounds of the estate covered in the first proper snow of winter, smooth and unbroken, the garden paths buried, the bare rose beds tucked beneath a layer that caught the early light and held it softly. She stood at the glass with her tea warm between both hands and looked out at it in silence. The snow changed the sound of everything. The usual creak and breath of the old hall felt muffled, gentled, as if the house itself had pulled something close around its shoulders and gone quiet. She looked at the white expanse where the rose garden lay hidden and thought about what William said the week before. It comes back every spring, it always does. She was still thinking about those words when she heard his footsteps on the stone floor behind her. William stopped beside her at the library window, 2 feet away, no closer, and looked out at the same white landscape. The cold came off the glass in front of them, and the morning light fell pale and even across the grounds of the estate, and neither of them spoke for a moment. Just 2 people standing beside each other looking at the same thing, the silence between them easy in a way it hadn't always been. "Heavy overnight," he said quietly. "It's beautiful," Clara said. And then, because it felt true and she saw no reason not to say it, "I didn't expect it to be beautiful." William looked at the snow for a moment longer. "It gets easier," he said. "The winter's here." She glanced at him. He was still looking out the window, his expression calm, his hands at his sides. He said it simply, not as comfort, not as reassurance, just as a fact he knew from experience, and offered without ceremony. Clara looked back at the grounds and felt the words settle somewhere quiet inside her, unhurried and warm. She didn't ask him what he meant by easier. She understood. The December evenings continued as they had since the East Wing repair, each of them in their chairs, the fire steady between them, the winter dark pressing at the tall windows. But something in those evenings shifted gradually, without announcement, the way light shifts in late afternoon, so slowly you don't notice until suddenly everything looks different. The silences felt less constructed, less careful. William occasionally looked up from his book when Clara turned a page, just briefly, as if the small sound pulled his attention before he meant it to. His posture near the fire was less exact, one arm resting on his knee sometimes, his shoulders lower, the careful formality giving way in small degrees to something more natural underneath. One evening near the middle of the month, Clara looked up from her reading and found him watching the fire with his book lowered and his expression entirely unguarded, open in a way she had never seen before, all the careful distance simply gone for a moment, replaced by something quiet and almost sad and entirely human. She looked back at her page immediately, but the image stayed, his face in the firelight undefended, holding something she didn't have a name for yet but recognized the shape of a person who carries something old and heavy, and has carried it so long he no longer notices the weight except in unguarded moments, beside a fire on a winter evening. Her chest ached just slightly, in a way she didn't try to explain. One afternoon, Clara came to the library and found a book on the small table beside her usual chair. Not one of hers. A collection of English poetry, the kind she mentioned once in passing, weeks ago, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. She said she read it slowly as a girl and loved it. She said nothing more and asked for nothing. She picked the book up now and turned it over in her hands, feeling the worn cover, the soft edges of the pages. She opened it. On the inside cover, in William's careful handwriting, a single line. Not addressed to her, not signed, just placed there quietly like something left on a doorstep. For the long evenings, Clara stood beside the chair and read those 4 words twice. Then she sat down, opened to the first page and let out a slow breath through her nose. 4 words. Practical, almost impersonal on the surface. And yet, she knew what it cost a man like William to write anything at all. To acknowledge, even in 4 quiet words, that he thought about her evenings. That he thought about her. She said nothing at dinner that night about the book. Neither did he. But something moved in the air between them over the candles, something that hadn't been there before, or hadn't been acknowledged before, which was almost the same thing. Clara reached for her glass and felt his eyes on her hand for just a moment before he looked away. She kept her expression calm and her movements steady, and said something ordinary about the weather, and he answered in his usual measured way, and the dinner continued, as dinners always did. But the book sat upstairs on the library table, and they both knew it was there, and the knowing changed something in the quality of the silence between them that neither of them was quite ready to name. On the last evening before Christmas, the fire in the sitting room burned brighter than usual against the deep cold outside. Snow pressed softly at the windows. The hall lay still around them, that particular stillness that settles on Christmas Eve, as if even old stone houses pause to mark it. Clara sat in her chair with her poetry book open and the warm light falling across the page, and she was aware with every quiet part of herself of William 6 feet away on the other side of the fire. She read the same verse 3 times without taking in a single word. She looked up. William was looking at her. Not quickly, not by accident. He was simply looking at her, his book lowered in his hands, his expression open and unguarded in the firelight, the careful distance he always maintained between himself and the world, simply not there for those few seconds. His eyes were steady, not cold, not searching. Not just honest, in the particular way that honesty arrives when a person stops managing themselves for a moment and simply looks at what is in front of them. It lasted 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Then he looked down at his book, with the quiet composure she knew well by now. His jaw tightened slightly. He turned a page, slowly, deliberately, like a man giving himself something to do with his hands. Clara looked back at her own page. Her heart moved in her chest with a slow, certain weight. Outside, the snow fell over the grounds of the Duke's estate in deep, patient silence. The fire crackled softly between them. Clara sat very still and looked at the words in front of her and understood, with a simplicity that was almost frightening, that she was no longer uncertain about what she felt. She knew exactly what she felt. The only question now was what to do with it. And sitting in the warm quiet of the hall on Christmas Eve, with snow at the windows and the fire burning between them, and William turned carefully away, she understood that the answer to that question was not going to come easily. Or quietly. It came on a grey afternoon in January. Clara went to the study in search of ink. She ran out that morning. She wrote letters each week to an old friend in the city, small, careful accounts of her new life that left out more than they included, and she knew where most things in the hall were kept by now. She would find it herself. She moved along the shelves on the far wall slowly, reading spines, checking the small cabinet near the window, opening and closing drawers with the quiet confidence of someone who has learned a house and feels at home in it. She reached for a leather-bound journal on the lower shelf. It wasn't the ink. She could see that immediately. She started to push it back and then stopped. A folded paper slipped from between the front cover and the first page and fell to the floor at her feet. She picked it up. The handwriting on the outside was William's. She knew it instantly, that careful, measured hand, and the paper was old, the fold lines deep and soft with time. She stood very still. She should have put it back. She knew that. She unfolded it anyway. It wasn't long. 3 short paragraphs, the ink slightly faded, the date at the top marking it as something written more than 4 years before. Clara read it once quickly. The way you read something when you already sense it will change things. Then she read it again, slowly, standing alone in the quiet study with the grey January light coming through the tall window, and the fire burned low in the grate behind her. I have caused harm I did not intend and cannot undo. I moved where I should have been still. I assumed where I should have asked. I told myself what I felt was care, and perhaps it was. But care given without permission is not care at all. I understood that too late, and the understanding cost more than I can account for here. Therefore I make this promise, which I intend to honor without exception, regardless of circumstance or arrangement. I will not approach any woman, in marriage, in obligation, in any situation that places her in my care, with anything other than patience. I will not press. I will not assume. I will wait for however long it requires for her to come to me freely, without fear, without duty, without the weight of any debt she feels she owes. Whatever else I am, I will not mistake obligation for desire again. I will not be that man again. Clara stood with the letter in her hands and did not move for a long time. She read it a 3rd time. Then she folded it carefully along its original lines and slipped it back between the cover and the first page of the journal, exactly as she found it. She placed the journal back on the shelf at the same angle. She closed the cabinet. She found the ink on a different shelf entirely, almost by accident, and she took it and left the study and walked back down the corridor toward the library with her steps quiet on the stone floor. She sat in her usual chair. She didn't open a book. She looked into the fire and thought about the wedding night, the connecting door that never opened, the weeks of careful distance, not coldness, not rejection, but something she now understood completely and hadn't had the words for before. She thought about the reading lamp placed beside her chair, the book of poetry left with 4 quiet words inside the cover, the way he stood every time she entered a room, the way he answered every question she asked, and never once asked anything of her in return. He made a vow, a private vow written for no one but himself. kept in silence for 4 years, through a marriage of obligation, through months of shared evenings beside a fire, through Christmas Eve and snowfall, and the slow, unplanned intimacy of two people living under the same roof in the deep quiet of winter. He wasn't cold. He was waiting. Clara pressed her fingers together in her lap and looked at the fire and felt the full weight of how wrong she had been. Not cruelly wrong, not carelessly wrong, but wrong in the particular way that happens when you take the one interpretation that requires a person to be less than they are and hold it as certainty because it feels safer than the alternative. She thought about Margaret, about the year written on the back of the portrait in careful ink, about what it takes to write a promise to yourself and then carry it in silence through everything life places in front of you. Not as punishment, not as performance, but as a genuine reckoning with who you want to be. She thought about duty and honor and the difference between a man who keeps his word because he must and a man who keeps it because he decided, at considerable personal cost, that it was the right thing and the only thing. She sat with all of it for a long time. Outside the tall windows, the January sky pressed low and heavy over the bare grounds of the estate. The fire in the library hearth burned quietly. The hall settled around her in its old familiar rhythms, the slow tick of the mantel clock, the distant sound of wind along the stone walls, the deep, undisturbed silence of a house that had kept many secrets and offered them up only when it chose to. She understood now that William's silence was not a secret kept from her. It was a gift given to her, the gift of time, of freedom, of the absolute certainty that whatever she felt, if she felt anything, would belong entirely to her, unchosen by pressure, unshapen by obligation, entirely, freely her own. At dinner that evening, William sat across from her as he always did. He passed the bread. He filled her glass. He answered when she spoke and listened when she talked and looked at her with that steady, careful attention that she now understood the full cost of. Clara looked at him across the candlelight and felt something move through her chest, slow and certain and warm like the first real warmth of spring after a long winter, arriving not all at once but in layers, each one deeper than the last. She kept her expression calm. She said something ordinary about the week ahead. He answered in his usual measured way. But when she rose from the table that evening and said good night, she paused at the door just for a moment and turned back. William still sat at the table, his hands resting quiet on the cloth, looking at nothing in particular, with the particular stillness she knew so well by now. "William," she said. He looked up. She held his gaze for 2 full seconds, long enough to be deliberate, long enough for something to pass between them that had no words and needed none. Then she said, "Good night." "Good night, Clara," he said quietly. She went upstairs. But at the top of the stairs she stopped and pressed one hand flat against the cold wall and closed her eyes and stood very still, and the word he said, her name, just her name, in that quiet and careful voice, moved through her like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. She stood there for a long moment. Then she went to her room, and for the first time since the night of the wedding, she didn't lie awake wondering what kind of man William was. She knew exactly what kind of man he was. The question now was much simpler and much harder. What was she going to do about it? February arrived with cold rain and restless skies. The snow that covered the estate grounds through January softened and pulled back slowly, leaving the garden paths dark and wet, the soil exposed in uneven patches between stubborn patches of white. Clara walked the grounds each morning anyway, her coat pulled close, her boots quiet on the stone. She liked the estate in this in-between state, not fully winter, not yet anything else, just the raw and honest shape of things before the season decided what it was going to become. She thought about that sometimes, about in-between states, about the particular suspended quality of her own life inside the hall, what it was and what it was becoming, and the narrow, uncertain space between those two things where she currently lived. She thought about William constantly now, and she did nothing about it, and that was its own kind of tension. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in the second week of February. Clara recognized the handwriting on the seal before she broke it. The solicitor, Greaves, the same careful script from the office on the narrow street where she first learned the full shape of her father's debt. She opened it at the breakfast table, alone, the grey morning light coming in flat through the east-facing windows. It was brief. A creditor, one whose claim was not fully included in the original settlement, pressed the matter through a separate channel. A sum remained outstanding. Greaves considered it advisable to inform the Duke at the earliest opportunity. Clara folded the letter and set it on the table beside her cup. She sat with it for the rest of the morning. She didn't want to bring it to him. Not because she feared his reaction. She stopped fearing William sometime in November, and the letter in the study erased whatever small remainder existed. No. She didn't want to bring it to him, because it felt like stepping back across a line she crossed quietly, without ceremony some weeks ago, without marking the moment. It felt like returning to the original terms, like reminding them both, and herself most of all, that she arrived here as a debt settled, that the marriage began in obligation, that whatever grew quietly in the sitting room through the long winter evenings was built on a foundation she preferred not to examine too closely on difficult mornings. She sat at the breakfast table long after the tea went cold and looked at the folded letter, and understood something she hadn't let herself understand before. She stopped thinking of herself as a debt a long time ago. She hadn't realized it until right now, when something threatened to make her feel like one again. At dinner that evening, she told him. She placed the letter on the table between them without preamble and explained it plainly. What Greaves wrote, what remained outstanding, what it meant. William picked it up. He read it without speaking, his expression steady, one hand resting flat on the white tablecloth. Clara watched his face and saw the moment he understood the full situation, a small tightening along his jaw, there and gone, the only evidence that the news landed with any weight at all. He set the letter down. "I'll write to Greaves in the morning," he said. "You don't need to manage this alone," Clara said. "If there's anything I can—" Clara. She stopped. He used her name the way he always used it now, quietly, with a certainty that carried no force but somehow closed the distance between them more completely than anything louder could have. He looked at her across the candlelight with that steady, open gaze she had come to know as the most honest thing about him. "It will be handled," he said simply. "That's all." She nodded. She picked up her glass. She said something ordinary, and the dinner continued, and the candles burned quietly between them. But the evening felt different after that, shifted in some quality she couldn't point to directly, warmer somehow, as if the letter and what followed it pulled something into the open that had been waiting at the edge of things for weeks. After dinner, they moved to the sitting room as they always did now. William sat in his chair and opened his book. Clara sat in hers. The fire burned bright and steady between them, and the February rain moved against the tall windows in slow, irregular rhythms, and the hall held them both in its familiar warmth. Clara tried to read. She turned pages at intervals that had nothing to do with the words on them. She was aware of him across the fire with an awareness that had long since stopped surprising her. The specific, particular awareness of someone you know well enough to feel without looking. She looked up. William's book rested in his hands, but his eyes were not on the page. He looked into the fire with that inward expression she knew, the one that arrived when something occupied him beneath the surface. His jaw was slightly set. His right hand rested still on the arm of the chair. She watched the firelight move across the side of his face and thought about the vow written in faded ink in that leather journal on the study shelf, about what it means to carry a promise like that through 4 years of silence and keep it unchanged through everything, through obligation and proximity and the slow, unplanned accumulation of winter evenings beside a fire. He felt her watching. He turned his head and met her eyes. Neither of them looked away this time. The fire crackled softly between them. The rain pressed at the windows. The clock on the mantel marked the slow seconds, and the hall lay perfectly still around them, and something passed between Clara and William in that long, quiet look, something that didn't need words and wouldn't have been improved by them. An acknowledgement, simple and clear and slightly frightening in how much it contained. Then William looked back at his book. Clara looked back at hers. But the room felt different now, charged in some quiet way, the air between them holding something new and unresolved, something that the long winter months had been building toward, without either of them giving it a name. Later that night, long after the fire burned to embers and William said his quiet goodnight and his footsteps faded down the corridor, Clara sat alone in the sitting room in the near dark. She didn't go upstairs immediately. She sat in the warmth that remained from the fire and listened to the rain at the windows and thought about the look they held across the room, about his face in the firelight, open, unguarded, holding something he hadn't decided what to do with any more than she had. About the way he said her name at the dinner table. Clara. Quiet and certain, as if it was the most natural word in the world. She thought about his vow. I will wait for however long it requires. He was still waiting. She understood that now completely. He would go on waiting, through February, through the thaw, through spring and whatever came after, with the same patient, honorable silence he maintained from the very first night. He would never press, never ask, never make her feel that anything was owed or expected. He would simply be there, steady and present and careful, on the other side of the fire for as long as it took. Clara looked at the dark window and felt the rain against the glass and pressed her fingers together in her lap and understood, with a clarity that was both simple and enormous, that the waiting was over. Not because she felt she should, not because of duty or obligation or the debt that started all of this, because she wanted to, because she chose it freely, entirely, with no weight behind it but her own. She just needed the right moment. And sitting alone in the quiet dark of the hall, with the fire gone to embers and the rain speaking steadily against the glass, she understood that the moment was coming soon. She could feel it the way you feel the end of winter, not yet arrived but close, present in the air, certain. She rose from the chair and went upstairs. And for the first time since the night she arrived at this house as a stranger in an ivory dress, she fell asleep quickly and easily, and without a single unanswered question keeping her from it. March came in hard and cold. A week of storms moved through the valley one after another, each one arriving before the last fully cleared, grey skies pressing low over the estate grounds, wind driving rain sideways against the tall windows, the bare trees along the drive bending and straightening with a patience that looked almost like endurance. The garden paths turned to mud. The fields beyond the hall disappeared into a shifting grey that made the world feel smaller, contracted to the space between these walls, this fire, this particular life that Clara built quietly inside a house she once thought she would never call her own. She called it her own now. She wasn't sure exactly when that happened. William rode out on the third day of the storms. He said so at breakfast, briefly, practically, matters on the outer edge of the estate that couldn't wait. Clara nodded and said nothing, because she understood by now that telling him the weather was bad would not change the decision, and that pointing out the obvious was not something William required from anyone. He finished his tea, folded his napkin with his usual care, and left before 9. Clara sat alone at the breakfast table and listened to the sound of his horse on the cobblestones of the courtyard below, and then the sound faded into the storm and the hall went quiet around her. She told herself she was fine. She was not entirely fine. By noon the clouds dropped lower, and the rain turned heavier, and Clara moved through the rooms of the hall with a restlessness she couldn't settle. She sat in the library and read 2 sentences and put the book down. She went to the kitchen for tea she didn't drink. She stood at the sitting room window and looked at the long drive disappearing into the grey distance and told herself she was simply watching the weather. She was not watching the weather. She was watching for him. The understanding arrived without drama, just a quiet, factual recognition of what she was doing and why. She was watching for William. She wanted him back inside these walls, in his chair, on his side of the fire, present and unharmed and simply there. Not because the estate required it, not because dinner needed attending or the evening had a shape that depended on him, but because the hall felt different when he was in it, fuller somehow, more itself, and the hours without him moved differently than the hours with him, and she noticed the difference now in a way she could no longer pretend was ordinary. She pressed her fingers against the cold glass of the sitting-room window and watched the drive and waited. She heard his horse in the courtyard just after 4. She was at the top of the staircase before she decided to move. William came through the main door below, coat dark with rain, colour high in his face from the cold and the wind, his hair pressed flat and wet against his forehead. He looked up as he pulled off his gloves and found her standing on the landing above him, one hand on the banister, looking down. A moment passed between them. "The north fence," he said. His voice was steady, slightly rough from the cold air. "It's been repaired." "Good," she said. He nodded once, she nodded once. She went back to the library. She sat in her chair and pressed both hands flat on her knees and looked at the fire and tried to make sense of what moved through her when she heard the horse on the cobblestones, the loosening in her chest, The way her feet carried her to the staircase before her mind caught up, the way looking at him, wet and cold and entirely unharmed, settled something in her that she didn't know was unsettled. She sat with it for a long time. The fire burned quietly in front of her. The rain continued at the windows. The hall held its breath around her the way it sometimes did in the late afternoon, when the light was wrong, and the day felt suspended between what it was and what the evening would make of it. She thought about the vow in the journal. I will wait for however long it requires. She thought about his face at the top of the stairs, wet from the storm, composed, looking up at her with that steady, open gaze that held everything and asked for nothing. She thought about 6 months of winter evenings, and reading lamps and books left with 4 quiet words inside the cover, and names said across candle-lit dinner tables, in voices she still heard when the house went still. That evening they sat in their usual chairs as they always did. But something was different, and they both felt it. William didn't open his book. He sat with it in his hands and looked at the fire, and the silence between them was no longer the comfortable, easy silence of recent months. It was weighted now, full of something unspoken that took up more space than either of them. Clara sat with her own book open in her lap, and the words meaningless in front of her, and was aware, completely, entirely aware, of the 12 feet of warm air between her chair and his. 12 feet. She knew exactly how far it was. After a while, William set his book on the side table. He rested both elbows on his knees and looked into the fire with an expression she recognized as the one he wore when something occupied him too fully for ordinary composure to cover it completely. His jaw was set. His hands were loose, fingers loosely linked. The firelight moved across his face, and she watched him, and he didn't know she was watching. And for a moment he looked, simply and completely, like a man at the edge of something he couldn't quite bring himself to cross. Clara looked back at her page. Her heart moved steadily in her chest. He said good night earlier than usual that evening. He rose from his chair and picked up his book, and stood for a moment beside the fire, not looking at her, not looking away, just standing in that brief in-between space of a man about to leave a room. Then he said her name, quietly, in that way he had that made it sound like something considered. Clara. She looked up. He held her gaze for a moment, 2 seconds, 3, and something moved in his expression that she felt in her chest more than she saw on his face. Something that was almost a question, and almost a farewell, and almost neither of those things. Then he looked down briefly and said good night, and his footsteps moved down the corridor steady and quiet, until the hall swallowed the sound entirely. Clara sat alone beside the dying fire. She looked at the empty chair across from her, the impression still visible in the cushion, the book he read through 4 months of winter evenings gone from the side table. The fire dropped low, and the room cooled at the edges, and the rain had stopped outside at some point, without her noticing, leaving behind a silence so complete she could hear the last of the embers settling in the grate. She understood what that evening was. Not an ending, nothing as dramatic as that, but a threshold. That word William translated for her in the library all those weeks ago. The point where 2 different things meet. She sat on one side of it, and everything she chose next waited on the other, and the fire burned lower and lower, and the hall grew quiet and still around her. She was not afraid. She was certain. She rose from the chair, straightened the cushion on her side out of habit, and stood for a moment in the warm dark of the sitting room with her hand resting light on the back of the chair. Tomorrow, she thought. Tomorrow she would stop waiting for the right moment and understand that she was already in it. She went upstairs, and the hall settled into its deepest winter silence behind her, patient, unhurried, holding its breath one last time. The storm broke on a Friday. Clara woke to a silence different from all the silences before it, lighter somehow, as if the world outside released something it had been holding for a long time. She went to the window. The sky was still pale, still cold, but the clouds had thinned and pulled apart, and between them, for the first time in more than a week, she saw blue. Just a small piece of it. Just enough. She dressed slowly and stood at the mirror for a moment, and looked at herself in a way she hadn't in months, not checking, not composing, just looking. The woman who arrived here last October, in an ivory dress with cold hands and a sealed letter and no real choice left, would not have recognized this face. Not because it changed dramatically, but because of what lived behind it now. something settled, something certain. She went downstairs. William was in the study. She knew before she reached the door, the lamp burning, the familiar stillness of a room occupied by someone who moves through the world quietly. She stopped in the doorway. He sat at the desk with papers in front of him and the morning light coming in grey and soft through the tall window behind him. He looked up when she appeared. She came into the room. She didn't sit. She stood a few feet from his desk with her hands loose at her sides and looked at him, directly without the careful management she spent months practicing, and let him see everything she usually kept to herself. All of it. Simply and without armor. "I want to tell you something," she said. William set down his pen. He turned in his chair to face her fully and gave her his complete attention the way he always did, without reservation, without impatience, as if whatever she was about to say was the most important thing he had to do that morning. She took a breath. "I found the letter," she said, "the one in the journal in January." Something moved through his expression, brief, unguarded, and then he was still. "I read it," she said. "I know I shouldn't have, but I read it and I've thought about it every day since." William said nothing. His eyes stayed on her face. "You made a promise," she said, "and you kept it. Through everything, through all of this, you kept it completely. You never once made me feel obligated or pressured or indebted." She paused. "You gave me the most extraordinary gift, William. You gave me time, you gave me the freedom to feel whatever I felt without any weight behind it." The morning light shifted slightly in the window behind him. "I want you to know," she said quietly, "that what I feel has no weight behind it. No duty, no obligation, no debt." She held his gaze and kept her voice steady. "It is entirely, freely mine, and I am giving it to you because I choose to." William rose from his chair slowly. He stood on the other side of the desk and looked at her, and for a moment he was completely still, not with the careful, controlled stillness she knew from the early months, but with the stillness of a man who received something he waited for so long that the arrival of it required a moment to become real. Then he came around the desk. He stopped in front of her, closer than he had ever stood, the careful distance finally gone, and looked at her face with an expression so open and undefended that her breath caught. No composure, no management, just William, entirely present, holding everything he felt without trying to contain it. He lifted one hand and touched her face, just his fingertips light against her cheek, the touch of a man who kept a promise for 4 years and understood completely what it meant to finally, freely let it go. Clara felt the warmth of his hand against her skin and closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, he was still looking at her, steady and certain and entirely, completely there. "Clara," he said, just her name, just that. She reached up and placed her hand over his, the hand against her cheek, and held it there. And in the quiet study of the Duke's manor, with pale winter light coming through the tall window, and the grounds of the estate still and frost-covered outside, something that began on a cold October wedding night, with a door that didn't open finally, quietly, arrived at where it was always going. He kissed her gently, not with urgency, not with the pressure of months of waiting behind it, with the particular tenderness of a man who understood that this moment didn't need to be anything other than exactly what it was. Clara felt the warmth of it move through her slowly, all the way down, all the way to the quiet center of things, and she thought, with a clarity that surprised her, that this was what it felt like to choose something completely, not to accept it, not to endure it, to choose it with the whole of yourself without reservation. She thought it felt like spring arriving inside winter, like something coming back. 1 year later, the rose garden came back, exactly as William said it would. Clara stood at the library window on a warm April morning and watched their daughter move through it. Small and determined, her dark hair loose, her white dress already collecting grass stains at the knees. She was 18 months old and had recently discovered that running was preferable to walking in all circumstances, and she applied this philosophy to the garden with complete commitment, weaving between the rose beds with her arms out for balance and her face turned up to the pale spring sunlight. Clara watched her and felt something so full and uncomplicated that it had no name, just warmth, just this. She heard William's footsteps on the stone floor behind her, familiar now, entirely familiar, the sound she knew best in the world, and then his presence beside her at the window. Close, his shoulder touching hers. He looked down at the garden and the small figure running through it, and something in his face went completely soft in the way it only went when he looked at the two of them. "She found the roses," Clara said. "She finds everything," William said, a quiet note in his voice that she recognized as the closest he came to complete happiness. Their daughter stopped in the middle of the garden and turned and looked up at the window with the particular focused expression she used when she located something important. She raised both arms, a demand, unmistakable, and said a single word with great conviction. "Papa?" William's face, that careful, composed, honorable face that once held the world at a measured distance, opened completely. He lifted his hand and waved. The child accepted this and returned immediately to the roses, satisfied. Clara looked at him. He looked at her. And in that look was everything. The October wedding night and the closed door and the sitting room fire and the reading lamp and the 4 words inside a book and the January letter and the March storm and the April morning when she walked into his study and gave him the only thing that had ever truly been hers to give. He took her hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and steady, the way they always did now, as if holding her hand was simply part of the shape of his days, as natural as breathing, as certain as the seasons turning outside these old stone walls. Below in the garden, their daughter ran through the roses in the spring sunlight, and the hall stood warm and quiet around them, and everything that once felt cold and uncertain and impossibly far from what it needed to be had become, in the patient and ordinary way that the best things always do, simply completely home.
A cold October morning, I came with nothing left. A ring of plain gold given, no warmth, no voice, no breath. The door between us stayed closed. Through all that winter night, I lay inside the silence and waited for the light. But you left the tea still warm. You left the lamp beside my chair. You left 4 words inside a book that told me you were there. On the other side of silence, you were waiting all along. Not cold, not gone, not broken, just honoring your word. On the other side of winter, I finally heard your voice, and everything I gave you was given by my choice. I found the words you wrote yourself, a promise kept in ink, 4 years of quiet honoring, more than you'd ever think. I watched you by the fire, with all your guard let down, and I saw the man behind the walls, the most honorable I'd found. You never once asked anything, you never pressed or pulled. You gave me time, you gave me freedom, until my heart was full. On the other side of silence, you were waiting all along. Not cold, not gone, not broken, just honoring your word. On the other side of winter, I finally heard your voice, and everything I gave you was given by my choice. I walked into your study on a morning pale and still. I said the words out loud at last. I gave what's mine to give. You crossed the room so slowly, your hand against my face, and all that careful distance finally found its place. On the other side of silence, you were there the whole time, not cold, not gone, not waiting. You were already mine. On the other side of winter, the roses came back too, and everything I chose that day, I choose again for you. Just her name, just that, Clara. And she knew